The Middle East burns. It's SkyWatch TV News for Monday, October 5th, 2015. I'm Derek Gilbert. Russia's Air Force stepped up the number of airstrikes inside Syria over the weekend. The Defense Ministry claims 20 strikes against the Islamic State in the last day and a half or so. But the U.S.-backed coalition says the strikes have been against so-called moderate rebel groups. And it does appear that those attacks have been in areas that far from those controlled by the Islamic State. The problem is that those rebel groups, attacked by Russia, have been supported by the United States, and we've made promises to them to protect them against airstrikes from the Syrian government. On Friday, major media reported that the Pentagon was considering how to protect those groups against Russian airstrikes, including possibly the use of force. I asked Pentagon strategist Colonel Bob McGinnis Friday afternoon if the U.S. military was seriously considering going to war with Russia over the civil war in Syria.
What our concern has been is that we've given guarantees to various elements like the 30th Division and the Free Syrian Army and a few others that we would protect them should they be attacked by Assad and his air forces and the like. Now, of course, the Russians being in the mix makes this far more complex, and ostensibly we have been meeting with the Russians to deconflict air space so that our jets aren't running into their jets or bombing one another. What is a mystery at this point is whether or not we're going to follow through with the implied promise to protect those forces that now are really fighting against Assad and not really focused on ISIS, which has been our concern and the reason why we supplied them. Should, however, we try to defend them, then that puts us tete-a-tete with the Russians, who, of course, are there to guarantee the survival of Assad and the Syrian regime. And so the battlefield becomes far more complex, and where you have a lot of complex issues like this, and the sides are not all that well defined, much less the parameters of their controlled space, then accidents can happen. And I think that's the real possibility as we go forward.
Trying to take a long view here, how does Russian and Iranian involvement on the ground in Syria affect our goals?
Well, once Assad's regime is stable and protected, which of course is what Putin has in mind, and we saw that Lavrov, the foreign minister of Russia, met with our Secretary of State the other day, Kerry, in New York, as well as the presidents. And what they have in mind is a diplomatic outcome. So this really throws all the plans, I would argue, that we have had up to now out the window, and we have to put together a new strategy. Arguably, of course, our strategy has been dismal up to this point because we were trying to depend upon building a Syrian force from rebels that we vetted, and we just have failed miserably at that. And so I think that we'll come to some sort of accommodation in the coming months as to who will run, quote, Syria. Now, that does not address the ISIS problem. I do believe that Vladimir Putin is partly in Syria because we were failing to contain ISIS, and ISIS is a threat not just to us and the West, but also to Russia, because about 2,400 Chechens from the Caucasus of Russia are in Syria fighting with ISIS, and of course Putin is concerned that they will return home and further threaten his own stability in the south. And so he wants to stop it before it gets out of hand, and so killing the Chechens, the Russians there in Syria is more of a favorable outcome than waiting for them to come home and start another war. And they, of course, in the last century fought a 20-year war in Chechnya, and Putin has no desire to do that again.
What would happen if the United States just said, okay, Mr. Putin, you're there, you're taking care of the situation, we're just going to pack up our stuff and go home?
Well, clearly we have already lost a great deal of credibility, and Putin is beginning to dictate what's going on in that part of the world. I think our superpower status is certainly vulnerable at this point. We could do precisely what you said and accept the geopolitical consequences of losing faith with our Western allies in NATO, as well as losing the confidence of all the countries in the region, some of which we've already lost, and then it will have impacts geopolitically in the Far East as well. China is watching us. We've already bowed to Chinese activities in the South China Sea and the East China Sea, and as a result, we're not doing all that well. What the damage done by this administration vis-a-vis failed policies across North Africa and the Middle East and elsewhere is going to take decades to repair. That is, if it can be repaired and we get a strong commander-in-chief the next go-around. But at this point, we're perceived as very weak. And I think when you have the world's so-called superpower perceived as weak, that means that war and conflict is more inevitable. And so by being weak, I think the probabilities of a large conflation, a large war in the not-too-distant future is increased as a direct result.
Colonel Bob McGinnis is the author of the forthcoming book, Never Submit, and he'll be a featured speaker at Chuck Missler's Strategic Perspectives Conference in Coeur d'Alene, Idaho, later on this month. Meanwhile, there's been a crackdown on access to the Old City and the Temple Mount after a surge of violence in Jerusalem and the West Bank. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu called an emergency security meeting after 4 Israelis were murdered by Palestinian attackers last week. The violence coming in the middle of the Feast of Tabernacles, which concluded at sundown Sunday. Old City Jerusalem was closed to everyone except residents, shop owners, and school children, and the Temple Mount has been closed to all but Muslim men over the age of 50. There's been violence on the Temple Mount all last week. A ban on Muslim men under the age of 50 led to a group of young men last weekend barricading themselves inside the Al-Aqsa Mosque. And when morning arrived, they began pelting police with rocks and Molotov cocktails. You can imagine how that went over. Well, there were the usual declarations of outrage from Palestinian authorities regarding the Israeli police response. Jordan is considering recalling its ambassador from Tel Aviv over Israeli attacks on the Al-Aqsa Mosque. Israel accuses Jordan, which technically oversees the Temple Mount, of facilitating, collaborating with the rioters, allowing them to stay all night in the Al-Aqsa Mosque for the express purpose of rioting the following morning. King Abdullah of Jordan reportedly refusing to take phone calls from Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, and also weighing in on this series of events, Turkey's President Recep Tayyip Erdogan, who says that Israel is playing with fire on the Temple Mount, and added that the struggle over the mosque doesn't just belong to Muslims, but to Christians as well. And a couple of mainstream Israeli journalists are laying blame for the violence at the feet of Jews, specifically Temple Mount activist Yehuda Glick and his followers. Journalists suggesting in published remarks last week that the violence could be solved if the Netanyahu government would just have the courage to close off the Temple Mount to Jews. And all of this was highlighted last week by an electric moment during Mr. Netanyahu's speech to the United Nations Thursday. Midway through his 35-minute speech, Netanyahu called out the international community for its collective silence regarding the threats made by the nation of Iran against Israel. And he paused for a moment to emphasize his point and let the silence grow and grow and grow. 44 seconds, Prime Minister Netanyahu stood and stared down representatives from the international community during that speech. It was a powerful moment, and it underscores how alone Israel is when confronted with behavior that no other nation would tolerate. Unfortunately, America's top diplomats weren't there to hear it. Secretary of State John Kerry and America's UN Ambassador Samantha Power were called into a video conference just moments before the Prime Minister's speech by President Obama, and so were unavailable. Coincidence, we're sure. And in Afghanistan, over the weekend tragedy, fighting in the key northern city of Kunduz continued through the weekend as government troops backed by American airstrikes tried to retake the city from the Taliban, which captured the city last Monday. The Taliban claims to have driven Afghan forces back and to retain control over most of Kunduz. But a hospital there, operated by the charity group Doctors Without Borders, was bombed early Saturday morning. 23 people dead, including 3 children. About half the dead staff members of Doctors Without Borders. And the aid group is accusing the United States of a war crime for carrying out the attack. The attack, the bombing, lasted for about an hour and 15 minutes, reportedly continued for about 30 minutes after American authorities were notified that the hospital was taking fire. A military official told CNN over the weekend that the U.S. was hitting a target at the time, possibly an AC-130 gunship in support of U.S. Special Forces that are advising Afghan troops in Kunduz. The hospital, he said, might have been collateral damage, but he stressed these are very early preliminary reports. Afghan police in Kunduz say a number of Taliban fighters were hiding in the hospital compound. Doctors Without Borders has pulled its people from Kunduz, and they are calling for a full, independent investigation of the incident. Why do Steve Quayle and Timothy Alberino say that the Vatican is trying to cover up evidence of advanced technology that predates the flood of Noah? You can find out tomorrow night on SkyWatch TV, which airs on the Christian Television Network at 9:30 p.m. Eastern Time, 8:30 p.m. Central Time. That's DirecTV Channel 376, Dish Network Channel 267, the Glory Star Satellite Channel 117, and also streams live to the internet at the Christian Television Network's website, ctnonline.com. And of course, later in the week, you can watch it on demand on our official Roku channel. Tom Horn will be on the road later this month with Colonel Bob McGinnis at the Strategic Perspectives Conference, Coeur d'Alene, Idaho, October 23rd through the 25th. This is the 10th annual, sponsored by Chuck Missler's Koinonia Institute. Of course, Dr. Missler will be there speaking as well. Gary Stearman from Prophecy Watchers and Joel Richardson, who will also be a guest coming up on SkyWatch TV. If you need more information or would like to register, you can sign up at koinoniainstitute.org. If you have comments, questions, or suggestions for us, we do appreciate your feedback. Please send those to dgilbert@skywatchtv.com. And don't forget, during the month of October, for your donation of any size, SkyWatch TV would like you to have an important book, especially at this time of year, God's Ghostbusters, a series of essays by folks like, well, Chuck Missler, Gary Stearman, Tom Horn, Sharon K. Gilbert, the smartest person I know, and yours truly. That, our gift to you for your donation of any size during the month of October. To donate, log on to skywatchtv.com. Thank you for watching. As we keep watch, I'm Derek Gilbert, and this is SkyWatch TV.